Have you ever taken a moment to consider that you might have a direct connection to one of the greatest patriarchs of biblical history? This connection could be deeper and more intricate than you've ever imagined, stretching across millennia and leaving a lasting mark on human history. When we think about Abraham, our minds naturally drift to Sarah, his first and primary wife, or perhaps to Hagar, the Egyptian servant who bore his son Ishmael. But there's another, less talked about figure who played a crucial role in the legacy of this great patriarch. A woman whose story is just as fascinating as it is mysterious. Her name was Keturah. Through her, Abraham's lineage expanded in ways that still influence the modern world. Her descendants have shaped the history of the Middle East, and their impact might even touch your own heritage in ways you've never considered. In Genesis 25 verse 1, the Bible provides us with a simple but striking piece of information. Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. At first glance, this statement seems unremarkable. However, it opens a door to an extraordinary chapter in Abraham's life, one that is rarely explored in its entirety. This part of his story not only complements what we already know about him, but also sheds new light on events that still resonate in today's geopolitical landscape. Keturah was not just a peripheral figure in Abraham's life. She was central to God's unfolding plan, a woman through whom the divine promise of blessing to nations continued to spread. Keturah gave Abraham 6 sons, who became the patriarchs of great nations. The reach of their influence is still seen on the global map today. To fully appreciate Keturah's significance, we need to rewind and consider the time in Abraham's life when she entered his story. By this point, Abraham was already advanced in age. After Sarah's passing, the Bible shows him entering a new phase of life, one that God would use to further expand his plan. Genesis 23 verse 2 gives us a touching account of Sarah's death in Kiriath Arba, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham deeply mourned her loss, demonstrating the profound bond they shared. To honor her memory, he purchased the cave of Machpelah from the Hittites as a burial place, an act recorded in Genesis 23, verse 17 to 20. This transaction was significant. It established the first piece of land that Abraham's descendants would officially own in Canaan, a tangible sign of God's promise. While this marked the end of Sarah's chapter, it signaled the beginning of a new chapter for Abraham. Abraham was 137 years old when Sarah passed away. By today's standards, this age seems inconceivable for embarking on new ventures, but the Bible tells us that Abraham's journey with God was far from over. Genesis 74 captures the covenant God made with him. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. At the time of Sarah's death, that promise had only been partially fulfilled. Isaac had been born through Sarah, and Ishmael through Hagar. But God had more in store for Abraham. Despite his age, Abraham maintained remarkable vitality. Genesis 25 verse 7 to 8 reveals that he lived to 175, described as dying at a good old age. His longevity wasn't just a physical blessing. It was a testament to the fact that God's plans for him extended far beyond what seemed humanly possible. It is within this context that Keturah entered Abraham's life. Genesis 25 verse 1 presents her introduction in straightforward terms. Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. While the account is brief, it carries immense significance. Scholars have speculated that this marriage likely occurred a few years after Sarah's death, placing Abraham around 140 years old. This serves as a reminder that God often works in ways that defy human logic and expectations. The same God who allowed Sarah to give birth at the age of 90 now enabled Abraham, at an even older age, to father 6 more sons. Through this stage in Abraham's life, we learn 3 key lessons. First, that God's ability to work through someone doesn't diminish with age. Second, that mourning a loved one doesn't preclude future blessings. And third, that God's promises often unfold in stages, fulfilling themselves in ways we can't immediately comprehend. Abraham's decision to marry Keturah didn't detract from his love for Sarah or Isaac's position as the primary heir. Instead, it demonstrated Abraham's willingness to remain a vessel for God's purposes. Genesis 12 verse 2-3 outlines the promise God made to him. I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. By marrying Keturah, Abraham wasn't diminishing Sarah's legacy, he was expanding the reach of God's plan. Keturah became the instrument through which God fulfilled the broader aspects of his covenant with Abraham. Her role underscores a powerful truth. Even after achieving what seemed like the pinnacle of his life, Abraham remained open to new ways God wanted to use him. So, who exactly was Keturah? Her name in Hebrew means incense or fragrance, hinting at a connection to spices or aromatic goods. Some scholars suggest this could reflect her origins in regions known for trade, such as Arabia. Genesis 25 verse 1 introduces her simply as Abraham's wife, but 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32 refers to her as a concubine. This dual description might seem contradictory, but it reflects the social and family dynamics of that time. Interestingly, there's an ancient rabbinic discussion proposing that Keturah might have been Hagar, returning to Abraham in a transformed state. Her name, meaning fragrant, could symbolize spiritual renewal, much like how Abraham and Sarah received new names after encounters with God. Still, most modern scholars argue that Keturah was a distinct person, citing the Bible's clarity in identifying her as a new wife, and the fact that her children's names differ completely from those of Ishmael. What we do know for certain is that Keturah played a pivotal role in Abraham's life at a crucial moment. Through her, God broadened the scope of the Abrahamic legacy, forming lineages that would impact the ancient world and beyond. Her 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, each became leaders of distinct tribes and civilizations. Many scholars believe Keturah hailed from Arabia, as her descendants settled across regions spanning southern Palestine and the Arabian Peninsula. Genesis 25 verse 6 provides an interesting detail. While Abraham gave his primary inheritance to Isaac, he also gave gifts to the sons of Keturah and sent them to the east. This ensured that Isaac's role as the covenant heir was preserved, while also granting Keturah's sons independence to establish their own territories and legacies. Keturah's story might seem concise in the Bible, but the ramifications of her lineage are extraordinary. Her 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, each became the patriarchs of distinct tribes and peoples that left an enduring mark on the ancient world. The Midianites, descended from her son Midian, are perhaps the most well-known among them, as they appear prominently throughout the biblical narrative. The Midianites not only influenced the story of Moses, with Jethro, the priest of Midian, becoming Moses' father-in-law, but they also played a significant role in the trade and cultural exchange of the ancient Middle East. Similarly, Jokshan's descendants, Sheba and Dedan, became highly influential figures in their own right, contributing to the establishment of trade routes that became vital for the movement of spices, gold, and incense across vast territories. Each of Keturah's sons represents a lineage that extended Abraham's influence far beyond the boundaries of the Promised Land. Scholars suggest that many of her descendants settled in Arabia and nearby regions, occupying strategic areas that would shape trade, politics, and culture for centuries to come. Genesis 25 verse 6 offers an important detail. Abraham gave Keturah's sons gifts and sent them eastward unto the east country. This act was not a rejection, but rather a wise and deliberate move to ensure that Isaac's role as the heir to God's covenant remained uncontested, while Keturah's children were given their own space to grow, thrive, and establish themselves. This careful planning reflects Abraham's foresight and his understanding of God's overarching plan. Let us now explore Keturah's sons and their descendants in more detail, as each name in the genealogy tells a story that reverberates through history. The first of Keturah's sons was Zimran. His name, derived from a root meaning celebrated or sung, suggests that his lineage may have been associated with a prominent or joyful legacy. Many scholars associate Zimran's descendants with tribes that settled in western Arabia. Some historical references point to a location called Zimram, believed to have been an ancient trading center along key caravan routes connecting Arabia to the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence suggests that Zimran's people became skilled merchants, particularly in the trade of spices and incense. This connection is particularly meaningful when considering that Keturah's own name carries the meaning of incense or fragrance. Next, we have Jokshan, whose name means snarer or one who lays traps. Jokshan fathered two notable sons, Sheba and Dedan, whose names and lineages are highly significant in the biblical and historical context. Sheba, often associated with the prosperous kingdom of Saba in modern-day Yemen, became renowned for its wealth in spices, precious stones, and gold. The Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon, as described in 1 Kings 10, is traditionally thought to have descended from this lineage. Dedan, on the other hand, is linked to an important trading center in northwest Arabia. Biblical references, including Ezekiel 27 verse 20 and 38 verse 13, highlight the Dedanites' prominence as merchants dealing in luxury goods. Inscriptions from the ancient city of Dedan, modern-day Al-Ula, in Saudi Arabia, confirm their historical significance in commerce and trade. Moving on to Medan, Keturah's third son, whose name means contention or strife. While the biblical text offers fewer details about his descendants, historical and archaeological records suggest that Medan's lineage settled near his brothers in northwestern Arabia. Some scholars believe that Medan's people specialized in caravan trade, operating along key routes that facilitated the movement of goods across the Arabian Peninsula. Over time, it appears that Medan's lineage may have merged with the Midianites, creating a shared cultural and economic identity that further amplified their influence in the region. Perhaps the most famous of Keturah's sons was Midian, the fourth in the line. The Midianites, his descendants, are frequently mentioned throughout the Bible. They established territories stretching from the Gulf of Aqaba to the plains of Moab, creating a sophisticated and influential civilization. One of the most significant figures from this lineage was Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who is described in Exodus 3 verse 1 as the priest of Midian. Jethro not only recognized the God of Israel, but also provided Moses with critical guidance on organizing the Israelites' judicial system. The Midianites, however, had a complex relationship with Israel. They were both allies and adversaries at different times. For instance, in Judges 6-8, Gideon famously defeated the Midianites in a dramatic battle that demonstrated God's power. This dual role of the Midianites, as both contributors to and challengers of Israel's story, underscores their significance in the biblical narrative. The fifth son, Ishbak, whose name likely means he leaves or he forsakes, is less well documented in the biblical text. However, some ancient traditions and archaeological evidence point to Ishbak's descendants settling in northern Arabia, where they maintained a distinct tribal identity for several generations. There are references in Assyrian texts to a group called the Yasbu, which some scholars associate with Ishbak's lineage. These records suggest that Ishbak's descendants played a role in the shifting tribal dynamics of the Arabian Peninsula during antiquity. Finally, we come to Shua, the youngest of Keturah's sons. Shua's name, meaning wealth or prosperity, hints at the influence his descendants would wield. One notable figure from Shua's lineage is Bildad the Shuhite, one of Job's friends, who appears in the book of Job, Job 2 verse 11. Bildad's philosophical and theological debates with Job suggest that Shua's descendants preserved a tradition of wisdom and intellectual inquiry. Historical records also indicate that the Shuahites established a presence near the Euphrates River, with Assyrian inscriptions referencing a tribe called Suru in that region. This points to the possibility that Shua's lineage expanded northward, influencing regions far beyond Arabia. The legacy of Keturah's descendants extends far beyond the biblical record. Genesis 25 verse 6 provides insight into Abraham's thoughtful approach to ensuring their futures. But unto the sons of the concubines, which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward, unto the east country. By giving them gifts and sending them to the east, Abraham demonstrated profound wisdom. This act minimized the potential for future disputes over inheritance, while allowing Keturah's sons to establish their own spheres of influence. The phrase, eastward, unto the east country, suggests that their settlements spanned a wide geographic area, including regions in southern Palestine, northern Arabia, and beyond. Strategically, this division of Abraham's inheritance had far-reaching implications. Keturah's sons occupied regions that became critical trade hubs, connecting the Fertile Crescent to the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean world. Their presence in these areas facilitated the movement of goods such as spices, incense, gold, and textiles, commodities that shaped the ancient economy. Spiritually, this dispersal allowed the knowledge of the God of Abraham to spread to new regions, laying the groundwork for the eventual interactions between these tribes and the people of Israel. The legacy of Abraham's decisions regarding Keturah's sons cannot be overstated. While the Bible states in Genesis 25 verse 5 that Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, it also emphasizes that he did not neglect the sons of Keturah and the concubines. They were given gifts of considerable value and sent eastward to settle in regions away from Isaac. This act was not one of exclusion, but rather of preservation. By creating clear divisions of inheritance, Abraham ensured that Isaac, as the son of the covenant, remained the central figure in God's promise, while Keturah's sons were empowered to establish their own independent territories and nations. This division served multiple purposes. First, it honored the unique role of Isaac as the heir to the divine covenant, maintaining the purity of the messianic lineage. Second, it allowed Keturah's sons to develop their own identities, free from the conflicts that might arise from living in close proximity to Isaac's descendants. Third, it fulfilled God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, not just through Isaac and Ishmael, but also through the offspring of Keturah. Ancient Jewish traditions have preserved intriguing insights about Keturah and her legacy. While these stories are not part of the biblical canon, they provide a glimpse into how she was viewed by later generations. Some traditions describe Keturah as a woman of great piety, suggesting that she may have turned away from idolatry to embrace the worship of the God of Abraham. This spiritual transformation would align with the meanings of her name, fragrance or incense, symbolizing purity or devotion. One particularly fascinating rabbinic discussion proposes that Keturah may have been Hagar, returning to Abraham's household after many years. According to this view, her new name, Keturah, would signify her renewed spiritual state, much like how Abram and Sarai received new names when their faith deepened. However, the text of Genesis 25 makes a clear distinction between Hagar and Keturah, listing Keturah as a new wife and not as a reintroduction of Hagar. Additionally, the sons born to Keturah are entirely distinct from Ishmael's lineage, further supporting the idea that Keturah was a unique individual. What we do know for certain is that Keturah's descendants played a critical role in shaping the history of the Middle East and beyond. Through her 6 sons, Abraham's influence spread to regions that became central to the ancient world's political, economic, and cultural development. Many scholars believe that Keturah's lineage settled in Arabia and its surrounding territories. These areas, rich in trade and natural resources, allowed her descendants to establish thriving civilizations. Genesis 25 verse 2-4 lists Keturah's sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, and describes their progeny. For example, Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan, whose names are linked to regions and trade networks of immense historical significance. Dedan, associated with the city of Al-Ula in northwest Arabia, became a hub for commerce. Sheba, meanwhile, is often connected to the kingdom of Seba in southern Arabia, renowned for its wealth in spices, incense, and gold. The Queen of Sheba, who famously visited King Solomon, is believed to have descended from this lineage. The influence of Keturah's descendants extended beyond commerce. They were instrumental in connecting various regions, from the Arabian Peninsula to the Fertile Crescent, forming trade routes that would later become the backbone of ancient economies. In Ezekiel 27, verse 20, for example, the Dedanites are mentioned as merchants trading in luxury goods, a testament to the far-reaching impact of Keturah's lineage. Let us now explore the 6 sons of Keturah in greater depth, beginning with Zimran, the eldest. His name, thought to mean celebrated or son, hints at a legacy of distinction. Historical accounts associate Zimran's descendants with tribes that settled in western Arabia. Some historians suggest a connection between Zimran and the ancient city of Zimram, which lay along key trade routes. These routes linked Arabia to the Mediterranean, fostering economic growth and cultural exchange. Zimran's people likely became prominent merchants, dealing in goods such as spices, incense, and textiles, commodities that were highly valued in the ancient world. Next is Jokshan, whose name carries the meaning one who sets snares, possibly reflecting a skill in hunting or trapping. Jokshan fathered two significant lineages, Sheba and Dedan. Sheba is perhaps the most well-known, associated with the wealth and splendor of the southern Arabian kingdom of Saba. This kingdom is famously linked to the Queen of Sheba, whose visit to Solomon, 1 Kings 10, demonstrated the kingdom's prosperity and international prominence. Dedan, on the other hand, became a major trading center in northwest Arabia. The Dedanites are frequently mentioned in biblical texts, including Ezekiel 27 verse 20 and 38 verse 13, which highlight their role as merchants dealing in luxury goods. Archaeological evidence from Al-Ula confirms the importance of this region in ancient commerce. The third son, Medan, whose name is related to contention or judgment, is less prominent in biblical narratives. However, historical records suggest that Medan's descendants settled near his brothers in northern Arabia. Some scholars believe that Medan's people became influential in the caravan trade, operating routes that facilitated the movement of goods across the Arabian Peninsula. Over time, it is possible that Medan's lineage merged with the Midianites, creating a shared cultural identity that amplified their influence in the region. Midian, the fourth son, is perhaps the most significant of Keturah's offspring. His descendants, the Midianites, are mentioned repeatedly in the Bible and played a critical role in the story of Moses. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, is described in Exodus 3 verse 1 as the priest of Midian. Not only did he serve as a spiritual leader, but he also provided Moses with essential guidance, helping him organize the judicial system of the Israelites. The Midianites preserved aspects of Abraham's faith, yet their relationship with Israel was complex. At times they were allies, but they also became adversaries, as seen in Judges 6-8, where Gideon led a decisive victory over them. The Midianites occupied territories from the Gulf of Aqaba to Moab, establishing a civilization known for its sophistication and influence. Ishbak, the fifth son, whose name means he leaves or he forsakes, is another enigmatic figure. Although the Bible provides few details about his descendants, ancient records suggest that Ishbak's lineage settled in northern Arabia. Assyrian inscriptions reference a group known as the Yasbu, which some scholars associate with Ishbak's tribe. These inscriptions indicate that Ishbak's descendants maintained a distinct identity for generations, contributing to the complex tribal dynamics of the region. Finally, we come to Shua, the youngest of Keturah's sons. Shua's name, meaning wealth or prosperity, suggests that his lineage was marked by abundance and influence. One of Shua's most notable descendants is Bildad the Shuhite, one of Job's three friends. Bildad's philosophical debates with Job, recorded in the book of Job, reflect a tradition of wisdom and intellectual inquiry that likely characterized Shua's descendants. Historical references also place the Shuahites near the Euphrates River, suggesting that they expanded their influence far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. The impact of Keturah's sons reaches far beyond the immediate biblical account, as their descendants help shape the ancient world's economic and cultural landscapes. By settling in strategically important areas, they established trade routes and cultural hubs that would last for centuries. These trade routes didn't just move goods like spices, gold, and incense, but also carried ideas and spiritual traditions, weaving their influence into the fabric of human history. For instance, the descendants of Midian played a significant role in the international trade of their time. As recorded in Genesis 37 verse 28, the Midianites were involved in the sale of Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who then brought him to Egypt. This act of trade demonstrates their integration into extensive caravan networks that spanned vast territories. Similarly, Dedan's descendants created thriving commerce in northwest Arabia, where cities like Al-Ula, ancient Dedan, became pivotal trade centers. These cities connected the Fertile Crescent to southern Arabia, allowing the exchange of luxury goods like frankincense and myrrh, commodities that were not just commercially valuable, but also deeply symbolic in religious and royal contexts. The descendants of Shua, while not as prominently featured in the biblical narrative, also left a significant mark. Bildad the Shuhite, a close friend of Job, exemplifies the wisdom and philosophical depth that came to define Shua's lineage. In Job 8 verse 3, Bildad asks, "Does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert what is right?" This demonstrates the theological understanding and intellectual rigor that may have been characteristic of Shua's descendants. Assyrian inscriptions referencing tribes like the Suru, believed by some scholars to be linked to Shua, indicate that his lineage expanded into the regions along the Euphrates River. This geographic spread highlights the broader influence of Keturah's descendants as they extended their reach into territories far beyond their original settlements. Whether through trade, culture, or religious practices, these lineages were integral to the development of the ancient world. The Bible makes a notable point about Abraham's distribution of his inheritance among his children. In Genesis 25 verse 5 to 6, it is written that Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac, the son of the covenant, while Keturah's sons received gifts and were sent eastward during Abraham's lifetime. This act of dividing his estate while he was still alive reflects Abraham's wisdom and foresight. By personally overseeing the division of his resources, Abraham ensured that his sons would each have the means to prosper without competing for Isaac's inheritance. The gifts mentioned in Genesis 25 verse 6 were likely significant, possibly including livestock, servants, gold, and other valuable resources. Beyond material wealth, it's reasonable to assume that Abraham also imparted spiritual teachings and practical knowledge to his sons, sharing the wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime of walking with God. These gifts were not merely gestures of goodwill, but tools to establish new nations and continue spreading Abraham's influence across the region. Strategically, Abraham's decision to send Keturah's sons eastward helped avoid potential conflicts over the inheritance of the Promised Land. By placing distance between Isaac and his half-brothers, Abraham preserved the sanctity of the covenant while allowing Keturah's descendants to flourish in their own territories. The phrase, "unto the east country," in Genesis 25 verse 6, suggests that Keturah's sons settled in regions spanning from southern Palestine to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. These areas, rich in trade and natural resources, became the foundation for civilizations that would shape the ancient world. This division of inheritance also holds spiritual significance. While Isaac was the heir of the covenant, Keturah's sons were not excluded from God's blessings. Abraham's actions reflect God's inclusive nature, as the gifts given to Keturah's sons allowed them to become part of the larger Abrahamic promise. Their settlements in the east created a ripple effect, influencing neighboring regions and peoples in ways that aligned with God's plan to bless all nations through Abraham. The genealogies and historical records tied to Keturah's sons reveal a complex tapestry of nations, tribes, and cultures. In 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32 to 33, the Bible provides a detailed list of their names and lineages. Now the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. And the sons of Jokshan, Sheba, and Dedan. These names are more than just entries in a family tree. They represent the birth of nations that would shape the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the Middle East for centuries. The descendants of Keturah's sons became pivotal players in the history of the region. For example, the Midianites, who descended from Midian, played a central role in Moses' life. Jethro, the priest of Midian, became a key mentor to Moses, offering both spiritual guidance and practical advice on leadership. The Dedanites, descendants of Jokshan through Dedan, are frequently mentioned in prophetic texts like Ezekiel 27 verse 20 and Isaiah 21 verse 13, where their involvement in trade and commerce is highlighted. Even the descendants of Sheba, associated with the kingdom of Saba in Yemen, contributed to the global trade networks of the ancient world, exporting spices and precious goods that were highly sought after by neighboring civilizations. Abraham's decision to give all that he had to Isaac while providing gifts to Keturah's sons reflects a deep understanding of his divine calling. Genesis 17 verse 19 records God's promise. "Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him." By making Isaac the sole heir of the covenant, Abraham honored God's specific plan for the messianic lineage. At the same time, by giving gifts to Keturah's sons, he acknowledged God's broader promise that Abraham would be the father of many nations. These gifts were not insignificant. The Hebrew word matanot, used in Genesis 25 verse 6, suggests that they were substantial, likely including resources that would allow Keturah's sons to establish prosperous and influential lineages. By sending them eastward, Abraham not only ensured Isaac's role as the covenant heir, but also allowed Keturah's sons to fulfill their potential as founders of nations. This careful planning reflects Abraham's wisdom and his trust in God's ability to work through each of his descendants in unique ways. The implications of this inheritance division are profound, both historically and spiritually. Historically, it established patterns of territorial occupation and trade that would shape the Middle East for centuries. The regions settled by Keturah's sons became vital trade hubs, connecting the Fertile Crescent to Arabia and beyond. These trade routes facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices, laying the groundwork for the interconnected world of antiquity. Spiritually, this division reflects the inclusiveness of God's plan. While Isaac was the chosen heir of the covenant, Keturah's sons were not left out of God's blessings. Their settlements and lineages became part of the broader fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 12 verse 3. Through Keturah's descendants, the knowledge of God spread to new regions, influencing countless lives and shaping the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. The way Abraham handled his inheritance reflects a model of wisdom, clarity, and divine insight. By dividing his estate while he was still alive, Abraham took steps to prevent conflicts among his descendants after his death. This decision ensured that Isaac, as the chosen heir, would have full authority over the covenant inheritance, while Keturah's sons received gifts that enabled them to establish their own legacies. Importantly, by sending Keturah's sons eastward unto the east country, Genesis 25 verse 6, Abraham gave them the opportunity to develop independent nations in regions rich with potential, such as Arabia and the surrounding territories. This separation not only preserved the covenant promise through Isaac, but also created space for Keturah's sons to flourish without competition or conflict. It's worth noting that Abraham's decision was not merely practical, but deeply spiritual. He understood that God's promise to make him a father of many nations, Genesis 17 verse 4, extended beyond the covenant lineage of Isaac. By empowering Keturah's sons to form their own nations, Abraham participated in fulfilling this broader aspect of God's promise. The influence of Keturah's sons can be traced through both biblical records and historical sources. Their lineages helped shape the social, economic, and political structures of the ancient world, particularly in regions stretching from northern Arabia to southern Palestine. For example, the Midianites, descended from Keturah's son Midian, became a powerful and influential tribe. They were both allies and adversaries of Israel at different points in history. As noted earlier, Moses' father-in-law Jethro, a priest of Midian, played a key role in advising Moses during the Exodus. This relationship highlights the enduring influence of Keturah's descendants in shaping the spiritual and practical lives of the Israelites. The Dedanites, descendants of Jokshan through Dedan, became prominent merchants. They are frequently mentioned in biblical prophecies, such as Ezekiel 27 verse 20 and Isaiah 21 verse 13. These texts describe Dedan as a center of commerce, particularly in luxury goods like spices, precious stones, and fine garments. Archaeological discoveries in northwest Arabia, including inscriptions and trade artifacts, confirm the prominence of Dedan in the ancient world. Abraham's foresight in creating distinct spheres of influence for his descendants allowed for the orderly expansion of his lineage, fulfilling God's promise in Genesis 12 verse 3. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This orderly expansion ensured that the covenant promise through Isaac remained intact, while also allowing Keturah's sons to establish their own identities and make significant contributions to the world. The territories occupied by Keturah's sons, particularly in northern Arabia, became critical to the ancient economy. These regions served as the backbone of what later became known as the incense route, a network of trade paths that connected southern Arabia to the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. This trade route not only moved goods but also facilitated cultural and technological exchange between civilizations. The influence of Keturah's descendants in developing and maintaining these routes highlights their enduring legacy. Keturah's sons weren't merely secondary characters in the story of Abraham. They were foundational figures in the broader fulfillment of God's promises. Their lineages established civilizations that left an indelible mark on the ancient world. For example, the Midianites' role in the trade of goods like spices and incense helped connect distant regions, creating economic and cultural bonds that endured for centuries. The Dedanites' influence in northwest Arabia contributed to the region's reputation as a hub of wealth and commerce, a legacy that continued into later periods of history. These patterns of trade and settlement established by Keturah's descendants persisted for millennia, influencing the geopolitical and economic dynamics of the Middle East even in modern times. Their strategic locations, which linked key trade routes, made their territories highly desirable and often contested by neighboring powers. This historical reality underscores the far-reaching impact of Abraham's decision to send Keturah's sons eastward and provide them with the resources to thrive. The genealogical record provided in Genesis 25 verse 2-4 and 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32-33 highlights the foundational role of Keturah's sons in shaping the history of the Middle East. These records are more than just lists of names. They are a testimony to the fulfillment of God's promise that Abraham would be a father of many nations. From Zimran to Shua, each of Keturah's sons contributed to the tapestry of civilizations that define the ancient world. For instance, Zimran's descendants are believed to have settled in western Arabia, where they likely became skilled traders and merchants. Their influence on regional trade would have connected them to larger economic networks, spreading Abraham's legacy far and wide. Jokshan's sons, Sheba and Dedan, established territories and trade centers that became synonymous with wealth and prosperity. These lineages not only built powerful economies, but also influenced the cultural and spiritual landscapes of their regions. The Midianites, descended from Keturah's son Midian, are particularly noteworthy for their dual role in biblical history. They were both collaborators and opponents of Israel, highlighting the complexity of their relationship with the chosen people. On one hand, Jethro, a priest of Midian, provided invaluable guidance to Moses and served as a spiritual mentor. On the other hand, the Midianites later became adversaries of Israel, leading to conflicts that were recorded in Judges 6-8. Keturah's descendants not only influenced the biblical narrative, but also contributed to the broader history of the ancient world. Their settlements and trade networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices, shaping the societies of their time. The interconnectedness of these lineages with neighboring civilizations demonstrates the profound impact of Abraham's decision to empower Keturah's sons to establish their own nations. Abraham's story is often viewed through the lens of his covenant with God and the lineage of Isaac, but the story of Keturah and her descendants reveals a broader aspect of God's plan. Through Keturah's sons, God expanded Abraham's influence far beyond the borders of Canaan. These descendants didn't just inherit material gifts from Abraham, they carried with them the knowledge of the God of Abraham, spreading elements of monotheistic faith to new regions and peoples. The spiritual and cultural impact of Keturah's lineage is evident in their contributions to trade, religion, and governance. From the wisdom of Jethro to the wealth of Sheba, Keturah's descendants became instruments of God's plan to bless all nations through Abraham. While their stories are often overshadowed by the covenant lineage of Isaac, their legacy demonstrates the inclusiveness of God's promises and the breadth of his plan for humanity. The lineages of Keturah's sons were intricately tied to the trade routes that shaped the ancient world. These routes, including the famed incense route, connected southern Arabia to Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. The descendants of Keturah's sons, such as the Dedanites and Shebans, controlled key portions of these routes, which were used to transport spices, incense, gold, and other luxury goods. Ezekiel 27 verse 20 describes the Dedanites as merchants, dealing in precious garments and other valuable items, reflecting their role in this vital economic network. The influence of Keturah's lineage wasn't confined to material wealth. The spiritual and cultural impact of her descendants is also evident. For example, Jethro, the priest of Midian, is a shining example of how Keturah's line preserved elements of the Abrahamic faith. In Exodus 18, Jethro not only recognizes the God of Israel but also provides Moses with wise counsel on governance and leadership. His advice helped shape the judicial system of the Israelites, underscoring the enduring wisdom passed down through Keturah's descendants. This interaction reveals that the influence of Abraham's faith extended far beyond the chosen lineage of Isaac, touching other branches of his family in meaningful ways. The complexities of the relationships between Keturah's descendants and the Israelites are highlighted throughout the Bible. The Midianites, for example, were allies at times but also became adversaries. In Judges 6-8, Gideon famously led the Israelites to victory over the Midianites in a dramatic battle that showcased God's power. This duality, cooperation on one hand and conflict on the other, reflects the intricate dynamics of family ties and tribal politics in the ancient world. The Midianites were not outsiders but rather distant relatives of the Israelites, descended from Abraham through Keturah. Similarly, the Dedanites and Shebans had interactions with the Israelites that ranged from peaceful trade to moments of tension. The prophets frequently mention these groups in their writings, often in the context of judgment or prophecy. For example, Isaiah 21 verse 13-17 describes the caravans of the Dedanites, highlighting their role in the economic and cultural life of the region. These interactions remind us that the story of Abraham's family is deeply intertwined with the broader history of the Middle East, with Keturah's descendants playing a significant part. The legacy of Keturah's lineage is further evidenced in archaeological and historical records. Sites like Dedan, modern-day Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, reveal inscriptions and artifacts that confirm the prominence of Dedanite merchants in the ancient economy. These records, along with biblical references, paint a picture of a people deeply involved in the trade of luxury goods. Similarly, the kingdom of Sheba, associated with Jokshan's son Sheba, is renowned for its wealth and prosperity. The Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon in 1 Kings 10 demonstrates the cultural and economic connections between Abraham's descendants and the broader world. The trade routes established and maintained by Keturah's descendants persisted for centuries, becoming critical to the flow of goods and ideas across the ancient Near East. These routes not only linked different regions but also facilitated the spread of monotheistic beliefs, as elements of Abrahamic faith traveled alongside the merchants and caravans. The descendants of Keturah played a vital role in this process, acting as bridges between cultures and contributing to the diffusion of spiritual and cultural values. The geopolitical significance of the regions inhabited by Keturah's descendants cannot be overstated. The Arabian Peninsula, home to many of these lineages, has always been a strategically important area due to its location between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The territories occupied by Keturah's sons, particularly those connected to the incense route, became the backbone of ancient trade networks. These trade routes would later evolve into larger corridors, such as the Silk Road, which connected the East and West. In the Bible, Isaiah 66 prophesies about the wealth of nations coming to Jerusalem, mentioning camels and goods from Midian, Sheba, and Dedan. This prophetic vision underscores the enduring importance of these regions and their inhabitants in God's plan. The wealth and resources of these territories not only contributed to the economic prosperity of the ancient world, but also played a role in fulfilling God's promises to Abraham. The descendants of Keturah were integral to this process, demonstrating how God's blessings extended beyond the immediate covenant with Isaac. The influence of Keturah's descendants also extended into later historical periods. Assyrian and Babylonian records mention tribes and territories that can be traced back to Keturah's lineages. For example, inscriptions from the reign of King Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BCE, reference Arab tribes that scholars associate with the descendants of Keturah. These records highlight the continued prominence of these tribes in the political and economic life of the ancient Near East. The contributions of Keturah's lineage to the development of trade, culture, and governance were not limited to the ancient world. Their influence persisted into the classical and medieval periods, shaping the societies of the Middle East and beyond. For instance, the incense trade, which was dominated by the descendants of Sheba and Dedan, became a cornerstone of global commerce. The wealth generated by this trade not only enriched the regions where these tribes lived, but also financed the development of infrastructure and culture. The regions once inhabited by Keturah's descendants, stretching from parts of northern Arabia to southern Palestine and beyond, remain crucial to global geopolitics. These territories, marked by strategic importance in ancient times due to their control of key trade routes, continue to shape modern economic and political frameworks. The incense route, which their ancestors dominated, has evolved into modern shipping lanes and land corridors that serve as vital arteries for global commerce. The Red Sea region, for example, traditionally associated with the descendants of Dedan, remains one of the most important waterways for international trade, connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Historically, the Arabian Peninsula played a central role in the development of international trade networks, thanks to its position between Asia, Africa, and Europe. The descendants of Keturah capitalized on this geographical advantage, establishing settlements that facilitated the movement of goods such as spices, incense, and precious stones. These same regions today are home to oil and gas reserves that are vital to the global economy. It's remarkable to consider how the foundations laid by Abraham's descendants through Keturah continue to impact the world thousands of years later. The prophecy in Isaiah 60 verse 6 resonates with particular relevance in light of this enduring influence. The verse reads, "The multitude of camels shall cover thee, the dromedaries of Midian and Ephah. All they from Sheba shall come, they shall bring gold and incense, and they shall show forth the praises of the Lord." This prophetic vision not only reflects the historical role of Keturah's descendants in trade and commerce, but also points to their spiritual significance. Their contributions were not solely economic. They were also part of God's overarching plan to bless the nations through Abraham's lineage. The descendants of Midian, Sheba, and Dedan became known for their wealth and prosperity, built on the trade of luxury goods. Their role as merchants and traders placed them at the heart of ancient economies, and their territories became synonymous with abundance. Even today, the symbolism of camels, spices, and gold continues to evoke the image of a thriving and interconnected world, a legacy that finds its roots in the contributions of Keturah's sons. Modern geopolitics in the Middle East still bear the marks of the ancient divisions established during Abraham's time. The areas traditionally associated with Keturah's descendants, such as northwest Arabia, Yemen, and parts of Oman, are home to diverse tribal and ethnic groups whose cultural roots can often be traced back to the early settlements of Abraham's lineage. The tribal systems and family structures that persist in the region today reflect the social dynamics of the ancient world, where lineage and ancestry played a central role in identity and governance. Yemen, for example, which is often linked to the descendants of Sheba, continues to occupy a strategically vital position in global trade. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, has been a crucial trade route for millennia, echoing the importance of the incense route controlled by Sheba's lineage. Similarly, the ancient city of Dan, located in modern-day Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, has become a focus of archaeological study and cultural preservation, revealing the historical significance of Keturah's descendants in shaping the region's identity. The influence of Keturah's lineage is not limited to economic and political factors. It also extends to cultural and spiritual dynamics that continue to shape the region. The persistence of tribal systems in modern Middle Eastern societies reflects the social structures established by Keturah's sons. Genesis 25 verse 4 lists the sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah, whose names represent distinct lineages within the Midianite tribe. These lineages played a critical role in maintaining tribal identities that have persisted over centuries. The Bible also provides glimpses of how these descendants influenced the spiritual landscape of the region. The story of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law and a priest of Midian, illustrates how Keturah's lineage preserved elements of Abrahamic faith. Jethro's wisdom and reverence for God, as seen in Exodus 18 verse 10-11, reveal a deep understanding of spiritual truths. His role in guiding Moses and the Israelites underscores the spiritual significance of Keturah's descendants, who carried with them aspects of the knowledge and worship of the God of Abraham. The discovery of oil in the 20th century brought renewed strategic importance to the territories once inhabited by Keturah's descendants. The Arabian Peninsula, rich in natural resources, became a focal point of global energy production, with countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen playing pivotal roles. This modern wealth mirrors the ancient prosperity of these regions, which were once centers of trade and commerce controlled by the descendants of Sheba, Dedan, and Midian. The blessings of prosperity described in Isaiah 66, gold, incense, and wealth, continue to resonate in the modern context, as these regions remain crucial to the global economy. The connection between ancient trade routes and modern infrastructure is particularly striking. Projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to revive historic trade routes, often follow paths similar to those established by Keturah's descendants. The Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula, which were integral to the incense route, are now at the center of modern trade corridors that connect Asia, Africa, and Europe. This continuity underscores the enduring significance of the contributions made by Keturah's lineage. The tribal divisions and family systems that originated in Abraham's time remain deeply influential in the political and social dynamics of the modern Middle East. The prophet Habakkuk mentions the tents of Midian in Habakkuk 3 verse 7, a phrase that evokes the nomadic lifestyle of Keturah's descendants. These same regions, traditionally linked to Midian, Sheba, and Dedan, continue to be points of tension and negotiation among modern nations. The historical connections between these lineages and their territories provide valuable context for understanding the complexities of contemporary Middle Eastern geopolitics. For instance, the Red Sea, which played a central role in ancient trade networks, remains one of the world's most contested waterways. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, in particular, is vital for global shipping, connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. This strategic importance is a direct legacy of the trade routes controlled by the descendants of Keturah. Similarly, the Arabian Peninsula's role as a cultural and economic crossroads reflects the foundations laid by Abraham's sons through Keturah. The enduring legacy of Keturah's descendants is a testament to how Abraham's decisions, guided by divine wisdom, shaped the ancient world and continue to resonate in the present day. The regions associated with these lineages, stretching across Arabia, the Levant, and neighboring territories, remain focal points for trade, culture, and global influence. This profound continuity between ancient history and modern geopolitics reminds us that the choices Abraham made were not just acts of foresight, but part of a larger divine plan that transcends time. Isaiah 60 verse 9 speaks of the role of these regions in global trade, stating, "Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God." The territories where Keturah's descendants settled are described as places of abundance and wealth, reflecting both their ancient prosperity and their enduring importance in today's interconnected world. These lands, situated at the crossroads of continents, have always been vital corridors for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. The ancient trade routes established by Keturah's descendants, such as the incense route, shaped the economic landscape of the ancient world. Ezekiel 27 verse 20-22 provides a vivid depiction of these routes, highlighting Dedan's role as a center of commerce. The passage states, "Dedan was thy merchant in precious clothes for chariots. Arabia, and all the princes of Kedar, they occupied with thee in lambs and rams and goats. In these were they, thy merchants." This description paints a picture of thriving trade networks that were essential to the economies of the ancient Near East. These routes were not just conduits for goods, they were lifelines for cultural exchange. The descendants of Sheba, for instance, are closely associated with the spice trade. Spices were not only valuable commodities, but also symbols of luxury, health, and religious significance. The kingdom of Sheba, often linked to Jokshan's son Sheba, became a center of wealth and influence, exporting precious goods to neighboring civilizations. The Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, as recorded in 1 Kings 10, exemplifies the cultural and economic connections that Keturah's descendants forged with other nations. The spiritual implications of Keturah's story go beyond her descendants' material and cultural contributions. Through Keturah's lineage, we see how God's promises to Abraham were fulfilled in ways that extended far beyond the immediate covenant with Isaac. Genesis 17 verse 4-5 captures the breadth of this promise. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. Keturah's sons were among the many nations that God spoke of, demonstrating the inclusiveness of his plan. This inclusiveness is further highlighted by the way Abraham cared for Keturah's sons. Although Isaac was the heir of the covenant, Abraham ensured that all of his children received blessings and provisions. Genesis 25 verse 6 states that Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them eastward. These gifts were not merely material resources, but also likely included the wisdom and knowledge Abraham had gained through his walk with God. In this way, Abraham acted as a conduit of divine blessings, ensuring that all of his descendants had the opportunity to thrive and contribute to God's purposes. Keturah's story also teaches us valuable lessons about the way God works. The timing of her marriage to Abraham, occurring after Sarah's death and in the later years of Abraham's life, demonstrates that God's plans often unfold in stages. Even after the covenant promise had been fulfilled through Isaac, God continued to work through Abraham's life to bring about blessings for other nations. This pattern reflects the truth of Isaiah 55 verse 8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Keturah's descendants remind us that God's purposes often extend beyond what we can immediately perceive. While Isaac's lineage carried the messianic promise, the broader Abrahamic promise of blessing all families of the earth, Genesis 12 verse 3, was fulfilled through lineages like those of Keturah's sons. The spread of Abraham's influence across multiple nations demonstrates the boundless nature of God's plans and the inclusivity of his blessings. Another striking aspect of Keturah's story is how it illustrates the interplay between human action and divine purpose. Abraham's decision to send Keturah's sons eastward reflects his understanding of God's plan for his family. By establishing separate spheres of influence for Isaac and Keturah's sons, Abraham ensured that the covenant promise remained intact, while allowing Keturah's descendants to fulfill their unique roles. This act of wisdom not only prevented future conflicts, but also facilitated the orderly expansion of Abraham's legacy. This principle is seen again in the story of Jethro, a Midianite priest and descendant of Keturah. Jethro's relationship with Moses demonstrates how Keturah's lineage contributed to God's work in unexpected ways. In Exodus 18, Jethro provides Moses with critical advice on leadership and governance, helping him establish a judicial system for the Israelites. Jethro's wisdom and faith in God reveal how Keturah's descendants preserved elements of the Abrahamic faith and used them to bless others. The story of Keturah and her sons also highlights the role of human mobility in fulfilling divine purposes. Abraham's decision to send Keturah's sons eastward mirrors God's broader pattern of using dispersion to achieve his plans. Just as the descendants of Keturah carried Abraham's influence to new regions, believers today are called to spread the knowledge of God to all nations. Jesus' command in Acts 1:8, "And ye shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost part of the earth," echoes the principle of dispersion seen in Keturah's story. Keturah's descendants, by settling in regions beyond Canaan, became instruments of God's purpose to bless families of the earth. Their presence in strategic areas facilitated the spread of trade, culture, and spiritual knowledge, laying the groundwork for future interactions between nations. This dispersion reminds us that God's plans are often achieved through movement and expansion, bringing his blessings to new places and people. The ongoing presence and influence of Keturah's descendants illustrate the intricate ways in which God fulfills his promises across generations. Psalm 105 verse 8-9 reminds us that God's covenant with Abraham wasn't confined to a single lineage, but stretched across time and nations. He hath remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham, and his oath unto Isaac. While Isaac was the heir of the covenant, Keturah's sons were not excluded from God's blessings. Instead, they became vital players in God's overarching plan, forming lineages that shaped the political, cultural, and economic realities of the ancient world. The dispersion of Keturah's descendants to regions eastward from Canaan fulfilled a broader aspect of God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 verse 3. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This dispersion ensured that Abraham's influence extended far beyond the immediate boundaries of the Promised Land. The sons of Keturah carried with them the legacy of Abraham, becoming founders of nations and trade networks that connected the ancient world. Their role in shaping the course of history reminds us that God's plans are vast and inclusive, reaching far beyond what we might initially expect. The spiritual lessons from Keturah's story are as relevant today as they were in ancient times. First, her story teaches us about the breadth of God's love and his ability to work through unexpected circumstances. Although Keturah's marriage to Abraham came late in his life, her role was significant in fulfilling the promise that Abraham would be the father of many nations. This reminds us that God's purposes often extend beyond what we initially imagine, demonstrating his ability to use every stage of our lives for his glory. Second, the preservation of Abrahamic faith among Keturah's descendants highlights God's providence. Jethro, the priest of Midian and a descendant of Keturah, exemplifies this in Exodus 18. Not only does Jethro acknowledge the supremacy of the God of Israel, but he also provides Moses with crucial advice on organizing the Israelite judicial system. His recognition of God's power. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, Exodus 18 verse 11, is a testament to how the spiritual legacy of Abraham reached even into the lives of Keturah's descendants. Another key lesson from Keturah's story is the overflowing nature of God's blessings. While the primary covenant promise rested with Isaac, God's generosity extended to all of Abraham's children. Genesis 25 verse 6 records that Abraham gave gifts to the sons of Keturah and sent them eastward, providing them with the resources they needed to establish their own nations. This act of generosity reflects the principle that God's blessings are not confined to a single individual or group, but often overflow to touch many lives. It reminds us of God's promise in Genesis 12 verse 3. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This theme of inclusiveness is echoed in Romans 11 verse 33, which declares, "O the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out." The story of Keturah and her descendants reminds us that God's purposes are often far broader than we realize. Through Keturah's sons, Abraham's influence reached regions and peoples that would become central to the history of the Middle East, fulfilling God's promise in ways that extended far beyond the immediate covenant. The dispersion of Keturah's sons also offers an important lesson about how God uses human movement to achieve his divine purposes. By sending Keturah's sons eastward, Abraham not only preserved the purity of the covenant line through Isaac, but also allowed Keturah's descendants to fulfill their own roles in God's plan. This act mirrors God's broader strategy of using human migration and mobility to spread his blessings. For example, just as Keturah's sons carried the legacy of Abraham to new regions, the early disciples of Jesus were commanded to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth, as stated in Acts 1 verse 8. Ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost part of the earth. Keturah's sons, by establishing themselves in regions beyond Canaan, became agents of God's purpose, spreading elements of the Abrahamic faith and laying the groundwork for future interactions between nations. Their story reminds us that God often works through dispersion and expansion, using movement to bring his blessings to new places and people. This principle continues to hold true today, as believers are called to carry God's truth wherever they go. The historical significance of Keturah's descendants is equally profound. The nations and tribes they founded played crucial roles in shaping the cultural, economic, and political landscape of the ancient world. From the Midianites, who were instrumental in trade and governance, to the Dedanites and Shebans, who dominated commerce and luxury goods, Keturah's lineage left a lasting impact on history. Their influence is evident not only in biblical accounts, but also in archaeological discoveries and historical records that highlight their prominence in the ancient Near East. The interconnectedness of Keturah's descendants with neighboring civilizations reflects the fulfillment of God's promise that Abraham would be a father of many nations. These descendants acted as bridges between cultures, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and spiritual knowledge. The prosperity of regions like Sheba, Dedan, and Midian stands as a testament to the blessings God bestowed on Abraham's lineage, extending his influence to distant lands and peoples. Even today, the legacy of Keturah's descendants can be seen in the cultural and geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. The regions they once inhabited, such as the Arabian Peninsula, northern Arabia, and southern Palestine, remain strategically significant. Modern trade routes, including shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, echo the ancient incense route that was dominated by Keturah's lineages. These routes continue to facilitate the movement of goods and resources, just as they did in ancient times. The spiritual heritage of Keturah's descendants also endures. The wisdom traditions and practices preserved by lineages like the Midianites and Shebans reflect the broader influence of Abraham's faith. For instance, the story of Jethro, a Midianite priest, highlights how Keturah's descendants maintained a connection to the worship of the true God. This spiritual legacy continues to inspire believers today, reminding us of the far-reaching impact of Abraham's faith and obedience. In conclusion, the story of Keturah and her descendants is much more than a historical footnote. It is a narrative that weaves together divine promises, prophetic fulfillments, and historical realities that still resonate today. Through Keturah, Abraham became the father of additional nations, fulfilling God's promise in Genesis 17 verse 4. Thou shalt be a father of many nations. Her 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, each founded lineages that profoundly influenced the history of the Middle East and the world. The promise made to Abraham found further fulfillment through Keturah's descendants, who populated vast regions, established trade routes, and preserved aspects of the Abrahamic faith. Their contributions to commerce, culture, and spirituality reflect the expansive nature of God's plan, which extends far beyond what we often expect. Their legacy reminds us of God's faithfulness, His inclusiveness, and His ability to work through every individual and circumstance to accomplish His purposes.